whistle while you work and fish and throw on a badge lording over a community enforcing someone else's laws and rules. Seriously, you can't just fish with your kid and not remind everybody you're the one in charge? Since the early days of America's televised nostalgia, then living in immortality through syndication and streaming, law enforcement has been front and center in our hearts, minds, living rooms, and bedrooms. However, the lessons and stereotypes often portrayed weren't always for entertainment purposes only. One show specifically pushed a pro-cop propaganda narrative while wrapped in wholesome Southern charm and seemingly Aesopian morals to their stories. But what lessons did we really learn? The world was not black and white, and this show was out of place by at least a decade. Behind. What we didn't get was a clear depiction of Southern law enforcement or the kind of justice doled out by high-powered water hoses and attack dogs. Instead, we were served sweet tea and sit a spell on the front porch, singing our hymns and teaching our lessons. What it was brainwashing, y'all. And we fell for it, hook, line, and sinker. And folks, just like in the show, there's a hole in our fishing boat and we're taking on a lot of water. Cloaked in comedy and slathered in slapstick, the television shows we grew up on taught us the real lessons we took into adulthood. After all, wasn't it my generation and the one before mine who were literally raised on television since birth? In this episode, we're talking about America's obsession with color and the turning point for our culture, 1964, when color was the biggest issue Americans faced. Well, whether to buy a new color TV or stick to black and white. In the Black and White of Back the Blue Part 1, I explained America's problematic history with police and how contradictory it can be to our constitutional rights. I revealed how the authority to enforce upon we the people, this cookie-cutter, militarized, corporatized, union-protected, universal police, state, county, and local, was granted to the states in the ever-ambiguous 10th Amendment, one of the big constitutional wins for anti-federalists in those colonial days. The amendment said anything not specifically specified in the Constitution would fall under the power of the state or the people. And we talked about how police started as kingsmen, reported on the actions of their desperate and oppressed fellow kingdomers to the king. Then, America adapted that into early slave patrols, which easily transitioned to Jim Crow enforcers, to prohibition enforcers, to union busters, protest enforcers, to today's corrupt and contemptuous bastardization of the principle to protect and serve. In this episode, I'm deconstructing our ideas on law enforcement with an argument that we're herded into one pen of opinion or another. And a lot of it is the fault of one of the best shows in the history of television. And welcome to the podcast. In 1951, Americans gathered around their televisions like they had gathered around their radios the previous 2 years to get an inside look at the police solving crimes. Dragnet aired throughout most of the 1950s and showed the audience an inside look at what being a detective was like, or at least early Hollywood's TV version. It would end in 1959, but come back in color in 1967 in the form most people remember, with Jack Webb recreating his Joe Friday character and MASH's Henry Morgan sliding up as his partner. Films had showcased cops in many different forms, in drama, comedy, but, well, usually as the extras. The detectives were the stars. The uniformed officers were background, faceless badge numbers, there to take the notes and hand the witness off to the real star of the show. Dragnet was a lot of things, but funny wasn't one of them. What Dragnet was the first and probably most influential police procedural that set the stage for almost every cop show after. From Hill Street Blues to NYPD Blue, The Wire, The Shield, to Homicide: Life on the Street, CSI to the long-running Law & Order, and their many respective spinoffs. Dragnet may have dictated the narrative of how Hollywood still tells cop stories, but it's not Dragnet that culturally brainwashed, gaslit, and dictated the narrative for Americans to think cops were always the good guys. Nah, Dragnet just laid the foundation. In order to make people like cops, America needed to turn to comedy. Nothing desensitizes us more to atrocities than laughing at them, right? Brooklyn Nine-Nine, Reno 911, Barney Miller, and even as far back as Car 54, Where Are You? Cops were shown as bumbling, fumbling, flawed humans just doing their jobs the best they could, of course with some redeeming qualities. The misdeeds in the line of duty washed away with a witty zinger and a never-ending laugh track. All of that was possible because of one show that laid the foundation for our socio-political ideals on police, policing, law enforcement, and justice. Americans needed to respect the cops they watched on TV, but not fear them as much as they did in real life. Hollywood had to take away the one thing that made the cop terrifying and terrorizing. America needed a sheriff without a gun. In 1955, two Hollywood comedians came together for a Broadway play called No Time for Sergeants, about a simple-minded rural rube who enlists in the military and hijinks ensued. If that sounds like the plot to Gomer Pyle USMC, of course it is. The play was based on a book of the same name and in 1958 became a Hollywood film that starred both Andy Griffith in the lead rube role and his friend Don Knotts in a smaller, more authoritative role, both reprising their stage parts. 2 years after the film, Griffith would be featured on Danny Thomas's hit primetime sitcom Make Room for Daddy in what would serve to be the spin-off pilot episode for Griffith's own self-titled show. In this pilot, Thomas's character, Danny Williams, runs a stop sign in the small North Carolina town of Mayberry. The sheriff of the town writes him a ticket and Danny refuses to pay it. Then, when he decides to stand trial, pleading his own case, the sheriff changes the sign on the desk around from sheriff to justice of the peace. Danny finds out the sheriff's also the editor of the local newspaper and the town's mayor in that episode. Well, he smells small-town shenanigans and stands for his principles, spending the night in jail awaiting his sham trial. This was an episode plot Griffith's show would echo several times throughout the run, but as Danny warms up to the sheriff, seeing him as a person, realizing that in a small town people have to carry more weight, and of course the adorable ginger freckled Opie coming into the scene, fellow father Danny, sees the error of his arrogance and law-breaking ways and apologizes to the sheriff. Then it's happily ever after and everybody's friends. The show ran for 8 years and has become a staple of American pop culture in many ways. Primarily that way. The happily ever after. What Americans didn't see was that Southern police weren't all howdy y'all and you're just coming back now and you hear? What Americans didn't see on TV was the racism, white supremacy, racial profiling, tear gas attack dogs, or high-pressured water hoses. What America didn't do was paint an accurate picture of what living in a small town was like, especially in the South, or what experiencing Jim Crow was really like. In fairness, you rarely saw a person of color on that show, and if you did, they were way in the background. So that was pretty reflective of a lot of Southern towns back then. Maybe not so Southern, too. Most small Southern towns in the mid-20th century weren't too keen on allowing people of color to just wander around like they had lives to live. Towns like Mayberry and the ones I grew up in Tennessee weren't very open or affirming or friendly to people of color. It's entirely possible that Mayberry is the perfect representation of that period of America, because all you saw were the pickings and grinnings and front porch sit-a-spells, without seeing the bigger picture. But just on the outskirts of town, between Mayberry and Mount Pilot, there was probably down a side road, an entire town, an unincorporated community of people who didn't look like Andy, Opie, Barney, and Aunt Bee. It's historically plausible to assume that community was also terrorized by more than just Ernest T. Bass and the Darlings. It's quite a shuddering reality that, parallel to actual America, Andy might take Opie, Barney had tote Thelma Lou, hired Floyd, and maybe even Otis had come along for the ride out to that community and burn it to the ground while they all drank and laughed like it was a Friday night high school football hootenanny hoedown. Then waking up the next morning like nothing happened, all smiles and bless y'all's hearts. You say, what happened? Oh, ain't that a shame? I'll keep them in my thoughts and prayers. Then Aunt Bee brings the picnic to the sheriff and the deputy and their girlfriends, and everyone just hees and haws and hee-haws until the commercial break. But America wouldn't get reality television for another 3 decades. Instead, Americans were fed some imaginary make-believe twisted reality where all the worries and problems of the world could just melt away before a live studio audience in some 1950s white picket fence ideal utopia of American nostalgia. Except this wasn't Eisenhower's America anymore. This wasn't the 1950s anymore. Except in small southern towns, of course. In 1961, the year Kennedy sworn in, 3 years before the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Andy Griffith Show debuted and set the tone for network television. During this era, many shows featuring rural America dominated the airwaves. They weren't ever accurate and rarely were they flattering. This show ran from 1961 to 1968, then its spin-off without Griffith, Mayberry RFD, continued through 1971 with many of the same characters. For whatever you remember of the show, and all programming back then, television was an escape from reality. Programs didn't often break that fourth wall of reality with special programming or episodes addressing major stories. That trend would come in the 1970s as entertainment took on more of a socio-political importance. The 1960s were more about maintaining the illusion of that 1950s American perfection. The Andy Griffith Show would live by that sword and thrive by that sword and ultimately die on that sword. The Andy Griffith Show was primetime network TV's leading police program during the 60s. Events like the Cuban Missile Crisis, Martin Luther King's March on Selma, the Vietnam War, the Civil Rights Act's passing, and the space program were all headlines that weren't major topics on the show, which seemed to be set in a different world altogether. That was the point. During the show's run, John F. Kennedy, Medgar Evers, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King Jr., and Robert Kennedy would all be murdered, assassinated, in high-profile tragic events that cast a pall over America and brought terrorism, crime and punishment, law and order, social justice, and civil rights into America's living rooms, whether we wanted it or not. Just not in our television programs. The news talked about all that. TV was an escape from all that. TV was the fourth wall between reality and make-believe. I'm not suggesting the saccharine sweet tea of small-town Southern haha should have had an episode mourning civil rights leaders, but certainly the president. But it was a different time in America. Surely the Andy Griffith Show would have focused on some protests, since the 1960s was full of them. No. Television was an escape from those harsh realities. Maintain that fourth wall at all costs. Unless it's to sell soap, cigarettes, or some other product. Commercialism, after all, is what America's built on. This escape meant selling America a set of values, week in and week out, prime time, Mondays. Then, for generations to come through syndication. Of course, who knew in the early 1960s when Danny Thomas was pitching the spin-off that within 20 years, cable television, 24/7 programming, and 100 episodes gets you a fortune in rebroadcast rights would be the future? How would he know that this spin-off would eclipse his own show into trivial pursuit obscurity? Danny Thomas is more known for St. Jude's than Make Room for Daddy, thanks to the Andy Griffith Show. My argument has been for many years that America's opinions about the police and how we view law enforcement in this country are bred as much out of the cultural impact of the Andy Griffith Show as they are the British monarchy we discussed in part 1. With this show, America was presented a stark contrast to the good cop, bad cop paradigm seen in so many early 20th century films. In this situation, the police were juxtaposed with two very conflicting, different personalities. Both good men. Good cops, more or less. Well-intentioned, but different philosophies on justice. Pretty black and white. Very black and white. I'm specifically talking about the issue of color. 1964 to be precise. The issue that every American faced was whether to buy a color television. 1964 was the last year the Andy Griffith Show was broadcast in black and white, and it was the last year Sheriff Andy Taylor had his trusty sidekick, Barney Fife. On one hand, you had the supreme authority, the leader, the sheriff, who wouldn't carry a gun because he didn't want his community to be scared of him. He was there to protect and serve. You only need the gun to perform one of those actions. On the other hand, you had the reckless, power-hungry second-in-command, who really couldn't be trusted to be the first-in-command. So much so that whenever anyone would do anything wrong, he'd slap them in jail and throw the book at them. So much so that while he could be trusted to carry a firearm, he was forced to keep the lone bullet in his front breast pocket. Heck, when he did take charge, the sworn-in deputized civilians would be trusted more with a gun than he would. This was quite the parallel with early colonial British-inspired constables and watchmen. While a lot of this was for entertainment purposes only, I think we can all see a clear correlation between our current police and Mayberry mayhem. Many of our cops we probably shouldn't trust with a gun, and even if we do, they shouldn't be trusted with a loaded gun. Few police today see things the way Sheriff Andy Taylor saw things. This clear line is the thinning blue line, my friends. The difference is the separation in that ideology. Are you more of an Andy, or are you more of a Barney? When faced with someone in your community suffering from addiction, where do you stand? Clearly, if that person commits a crime or has caused some damage, it's a different conversation. Let's discuss Otis Campbell, Mayberry's town drunk. Otis would get sauced and commit all sorts of shenanigans. Few truly crime-worthy. A public nuisance, yes. Disturbance, sure. But an addict, certainly not a criminal. Or was he? Andy gave Otis the open door policy. Rather than go home and have an argument with his wife for coming in 6 sheets to the wind and then having to go out there when the neighbors called the police, Andy hung the key next to the jail cell. And Otis could responsibly lock himself in, keeping himself and the town safe from the consequences of his addiction. He might have sung up and down the street to the courthouse, but when he was there, he hit the hay, slept it off. Now that really got under Barney's skin. Barney was a by-the-books officer of the court. Giving any preferential treatment or leeway was chaos in his eyes. It isn't that he didn't respect Andy or Andy's tactics. It's that Barney wanted his way to work so he would be right too. Barney he didn't want to just be the deputy. He had ambitions too, you know. Barney would come in early the next morning and wake Otis up at the crack of dawn, giving him a Marine Corps drill sergeant wake-up call, complete with whistles and stamping of the feet, shouting orders and making Otis get up immediately and start exercises, chores, whatever Barney's latest harebrained drunk recovery technique could be that week. But for all the enabling Andy's behavior does for the addict, removing any consequence, thus eliminating the chance for the rock-bottom spiral one might need to achieve recovery, Barney's non-compassionate bully response to alcohol addiction is more problematic. Somewhere between Andy and Barney, there's this compromise of the role of law enforcement and how it should play in cases of substance abuse, addiction, and how it pertains to public peace and safety. Sadly, the ill effects of alcoholism weren't properly addressed with comedic plot points of secret stills and corn liquor marinated chickens and fifes. America came together and laughed at the very real problem facing most American families. And rather than turning to their dad and saying, hey, you may think you're Andy, but you're kind of Otis. Is law enforcement's place the court, the government, whomever, to regulate the addictive substance or the people who are addicted? Should those addicts be locked up, punished, boot camped into recovery? Or is it a more compassionate, less law enforcement, more social worker or therapist angle, something our taxpayer dollars should fund? We're okay funding police brutality, jails, for-profit prisons, and the janked-up court system, but why not invest those dollars in healing rather than punishment? But in the end, every end, Otis unlocks the door, puts on his jacket, and goes home, and everyone lives happily ever after. In Andy the Marriage Counselor, the 18th episode of the first season, the Andy Griffith Show addressed domestic violence. Again, this experience showcases a philosophical conundrum. The police shouldn't be involved in our private affairs in any way. It isn't the government's place to come into our homes and have us disclose our deepest secrets. However, when a couple like Fred and Jenny Boone fight the way that Boone's fought in that episode, ooh lordy, the cops get called. And when the cops really come out, it usually isn't a counseling session. Barney wasn't on board with Andy's proposed solution, sitting down with the new in-town Boones and making them be nice to each other. Look, after all, they could be really nice to everyone in town. It's just when they were home, the dishes flew. Andy observes them in the home and asks them to not say the mean things to each other first thing in the morning, because it seemed to trigger the other person, starting their day off with harsh comments. Instead of being mean and critical, Andy suggests starting the day with, now you say morning, honey, and now you say morning, dear. And they said morning, honey, and morning, dear, and they all lived happily ever after. Well, they didn't this time, actually. As it turns out, the Boones were miserable being nice to each other. The lesson in this episode wasn't that being mean to each other was wrong, and that psychologically, when you're harsh, rude, and critical all the time, abusive, especially to your closest partner, then it erodes the intimacy and can cause divorce in a best-case scenario. Worst case, the shows that occupy a lot of my IMDb credits that are a little more accurate to the topic at hand. Now, what this show did, what this episode did, was lay out the clear and present danger of some people just need to blow off steam by being mean and abusive to each other. There's nothing wrong here, nothing to see. Try to keep it down, okay? Everyone go about your day. Morning, honey. Morning, dear. And we all live happily ever after. There are morals galore in the Andy Griffith Show. Many have discussed the subject. I'm choosing to look at this from a more moral dilemma aspect, ethics. For all the positive aspects of the show, for pop culture, there was an alternative perspective that I'm not sure was considered before. Many of those morals have less to do with policing and law enforcement and more to do with just being a good person and community member. Part of that is not tolerating bigotry, which was a central theme to many of those early black and white episodes. No, not racial bigotry, of course not, don't be ridiculous. Classist bigotry, not even that. These were simple, humble, small-town Southern people. Even the rich people in town were Mayberry rich. The really rich people guest starred and came in from out of town. What this show did was something the Beverly Hillbillies made their entire plot, the hick out of Waterstick. To address bigotry, the Andy Griffith Show showed just how oppressed white, male, uneducated, probably mentally challenged mountain people could be. Characters like Rafe Hollister, who was ostracized for his rabble-rousing country bumpkin ways by the prim and proper city folk of downtown Mayberry. They were ashamed to have a man in overalls representing them at the choral competition until they heard him sing. Well, if that means winning. The Darlings, the mountain family of clearly inbreds, came to town to marry off the only girl in that small cabin of only men. Briscoe pawned Charlene off like she was property, auctioning her for the highest dowry. The clearly young and impressionable, uneducated, and very below mental and emotional developmental age girl would cozy up to the influential sheriff in his at least late 30s. After all, who wouldn't want to hitch their little girl up to the sheriff in town, right? What kind of person thinks that about their daughter? Many of the Darlings' stories involved Ernest T. Bass, the wild card loose cannon of the show. He was known to throw bricks through windows. Again, Andy and Barney's law enforcement styles ranged from apologies, restitution, and how do you do, Mrs. Wiley's, with Andy trying to Henry Higgins and Ernest T. into being a proper gentleman. Barney, well, he wanted Ernest T. in Otis's boot camp. The episode titled My Fair Ernest T. Bass was where Andy tried to convince the town's snobs that Bass was actually a well-spoken, well-mannered, calm fellow named Oliver Gossage, and wasn't an out-of-control sociopathic lunatic. Even though by the end of it, it was like Tarzan at the zoo, the underlying moral of that story was to not try to help people assimilate, or even that some people should assimilate into other people's narrow-minded ways of thinking. Now, many of the lessons in similar themed episodes were about accepting others as they are, with the even more than just normal Mayberry rural rubes like Rafe and the Darlings, Ernest T., and even posh and proper British butler Mr. Malcolm Merriweather. The lesson was about welcoming outsiders, eventually, even if they talk funny, act different, or ain't as cleaned up, buttoned up, or privileged as we might be. Or in Malcolm's case, are actually cleaned up, buttoned up, and make everyone in town look like the rural rubes. Ultimately, it was a lesson in classism. Even the most posh of Mayberry looked down on someone who lived 5 miles away and probably provided the milk they drank every morning. It's an examination of the asinine arrogance of aristocratic attitudes. By the end of the run of the Andy Griffith Show, the sweet tea had soured, and America wasn't in on the hokey jokey anymore. Laugh In was raw sketch comedy that was something out of an acid trip. The Mod Squad was a cop show, integrated and young. Mayberry was becoming more and more unreal, more out of touch, more unbelievable in the growing, grittier landscape of primetime. Mayberry was a town devoid of diversity. Diane Carroll debuted as the first black female lead in a sitcom the year Griffith signed off the show. Amidst Vietnam War protests, the civil disorder, assassinations, and clashing cultures, America just wasn't buying the good cop shtick anymore. America was heading into the Nixonian era, and the Andy Griffith Show was Truman Eisenhower era Americana, and just as outdated as those Norman Rockwell paintings. By the time Barney Miller, Night Court, and other comedies centered around the justice system, America was full on into pop culture, into 24/7 television, cable, and never-ending syndication of shows like The Andy Griffith Show, which has become more popular over the years than it ever was in its original run. America was desensitized to many of the horrors of policing because either we weren't shown those harsh realities in a context that was appropriate, or the shows we watched sugarcoated a lot of it to the point that reality just didn't seem as real until it happened to us, which it rarely did, mathematically speaking, of course. There was another Southern police-themed show that would follow the Andy Griffith Show, putting a slightly different spin on the good cop theme, but turning it on its Southern boot heel with a bad cop, worse cop routine, making the outlaws the good guys and the bumbling town hierarchy the clowns. This time, this show came at a critical turning point for American culture and would further warp our views on law enforcement. So stick around and see what happens next. In 1968, Richard Nixon was elected President of the United States amidst culture clashes and civil unrest. While television was a welcome escape for society, it was becoming harder and harder to ignore the real threats staring us in our faces after prime time during the evening news. In 1968, it was also the Dixiecrat election, where Alabama Klan Grand Wizard George C. Wallace split from the Democrats once and for all, running as an independent candidate. That split, not necessarily in the Democratic Party, but in American ethics, character, morals, humanity, that was where some just weren't ready to accept the Post-Civil Rights Act America or forgive those who pushed it on them. That split and Nixon's Republicans ready to welcome literally any voter who would win them the election won Nixon the election. While the Democrats stood tall, making it clear the white supremacist, Jim Crow, Confederate, anti-federalist agenda of our shameful treasonous past would no longer be supported, validated, or tolerated, the racists and white supremacists in America flocked to George C. Wallace. While the closet racists and still prejudiced, bigoted oppressors, unwilling to come out of their Klan closet and live their true, authentic selves just yet, voted Republican for Nixon. I'm going to ask you to pause this and just sit on that for a moment, if you would. Because just like in recent history, everyone knew what Tricky Dick was before they voted for him. Wallace, too. Then, once the rural South was exposed before America in the 1968 election, Americans saw in full color, on a breaking news election map, the massive cluster of pro-George Wallace white supremacist support through exclusively the Southeast. Americans all across the country saw that nearly 10 million people voted for Wallace. He won Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia, most of the Confederate deep sociopathic slaver South. The Carolinas, Tennessee, Missouri, and most of the heartland rural areas of this country went red for Nixon, who again opened his arms to literally anyone who would help him win. From sea to shining sea, Americans can see the problematic ideals of so many. This isn't to suggest that all nearly 32 million Americans who voted for Nixon or the nearly 31 who voted for Hubert H. Humphrey, the Democrats' Triple H, were or weren't racist. I'm saying a lot of white America wasn't where we are today, and back then minority American votes are a separate discussion because a lot of whites worked very hard to ensure people of color couldn't and wouldn't vote. Americans were seeing the horrors of the world and the many atrocities that accompany progress. Change is hard. People will fight change. Hollywood didn't. Realizing that most of their shows on television at the time were suddenly problematic, TV studios hedged their bets that times they were a-changin', and top-rated or not, Hollywood did not want that audience. By 1971, TV networks gave the Order 66 on Southern Twang in primetime. Andy Griffith had moved on from Mayberry the year Nixon won. 3 years later, during the height of the Vietnam War, the continuation of his show, Mayberry RFD, would be canceled in what is referred to as the Rural Purge. This ended a profitable exploitation and stereotyping of the rural South networks had been enjoying since 1957 when The Real McCoys first aired. For those who had grown up on Ma and Pa Kettle, this brand of Southern depiction was normal, acceptable, and hilarious, until it stopped being funny to be from small Southern towns that didn't have a lot of people of color. Once TV went to color in the mid-1960s, that was impossible to ignore. And with the shifting cultural tides by the late 1960s, networks like CBS wanted to beat the curve and distanced themselves from this type of sundown town programming. Having fed at the trough of Southern small-town exploitation, CBS, who had a slew of rural representation, was snickered at around Hollywood, called country broadcast system. Well, that didn't sit well with the network or the advertisers. In 1969, Gomer Pyle USMC was popular, but under criticism. Having ripped off the theme for the show from the book and Broadway play that introduced Andy Griffith and Don Knotts a decade and a half prior, it was a familiar theme, but the changing social tides and culture clashes were too much for the audience to buy. The show aired during the Vietnam War and was about the military, but never mentioned the war once. It wasn't technically part of the rural purge by the networks. The star, Gomer himself, Jim Nabors, wanted to leave and do something else, more authentic to himself. Gomer was over, replaced with Nabors' own variety show, the Jim Nabors Hour, which would end at the 71 purge. Other variety shows like Hee Haw, The Red Skelton Show were cut, while shows like Petticoat Junction had been canceled the season before. By 1971, the South was all but whitewashed off primetime. Beverly Hillbillies, Mayberry RFD, Green Acres, canceled. Now that was cancel culture. American TV networks realizing that rural America was out of place, out of date, and out of touch. They realized this, of course, because market research and ratings told them. CBS, who fancied themselves aimed at a more upscale audience and advertiser, had become sneered at as the Hillbilly Network. Wait, what's that? What's that, girl? They canceled Lassie too? At least she survived for a couple more years in syndication. American TV networks mass canceled anything that remotely had a Southern twang. Why? Plain and simple, the audience wasn't buying it and advertisers didn't want their kind in their stores. Remember when I spoke about in previous episodes about perceived or privileged oppression? Realize that as much as we celebrate diversity and representation, what happened between 1969 and 1971, particularly at CBS, was tantamount to TV genocide from one perspective. The fact is, most people in this country looked down on rural South and Southerners and only watched along for entertainment purposes only. But when the news headlines make it clear where the real problem lies in America, well, Hogan's Heroes was also canceled. Not so much in the rural purge, but along the same lines. It seems, seeing the American South behave like Nazis to America's own people, that maybe America didn't feel like laughing at Nazis anymore, or normalize seeing Nazis anymore. A new network president comes in and wipes the slate clean, but most TV executives didn't like the programming to begin with, and many of the stars didn't. Frances Bavier, who played Aunt Bee on The Andy Griffith Show, almost resented the role and refused to put on a Southern accent for the part. It's like going to the Redneck Revolution comedy tour, and laughing your get her done off, and then somebody whispers to you, hey, these people are the same ones who, and then you can't laugh anymore because then that person says, hey, and you see all these people laughing? If you think this is funny, you might be and you can't stop seeing the people still laughing. I'm sure those guys are fine, but these shows were problematic and left audiences with a mixed set of values. The tides of entertainment had shifted, and Mayberry-flavored Southern charm gave way to the harsh realities. America was in color, and that meant we had to talk about color. Southern rural Americans felt like they got the shaft by the self-righteous better-thans, with political issues shoved in their faces every episode during primetime, ignoring the actual issues these episodes were discussing for them. It was another slap in the face for privileged people who feel oppressed. CBS removed those small-town Southern simpletons and replaced them with urban and middle-class simpletons. All in the Family, followed by spin-offs, the feminist flair matriarch Maude, and black sassy neighbors, the Jeffersons, would peel back that curtain and tell a more honest depiction of lower middle-class American ideals. It would do so by showcasing different levels of our culture. The Bunkers, white lower middle class. The Findleys, typical well-off middle America, still white. But a black maid named Florida who would go on to then star in Good Times, set in the projects. Then the Jeffersons, black lower middle class who worked hard and hit it big, then moved on up to that deluxe apartment in the sky. But the damage had been done. The 1960s was a changing time and television entertainment let us down. When writers and executives could have led the way with stories to soften the blow, the crashing down of our delicate realities left us scattered, divided. where Gomer Pyle let us down, MASH picked right up with the laughs and some realities. Andy and Barney retired while urban apartment sharers Oscar and Felix coupled oddly. TV Cops evolved as well, from the Mayberry Courthouse to Columbo, which debuted in 1971, to Kojak, Rockford, and then Chips. America was getting back on track with depicting cops as the great solvers of crimes and protectors and servers of their communities. Until the South rose again in 1979. With the rural purge by the beginning of the decade, a Southern accent wasn't going to get you much work on network television anymore. Seems many actors needed a bit of enriigging for the 70s. Eradicated from television might have been the problematic, outdated, out-of-touch rural rubes, but what was also wiped off our front porches were the values and morals some of those shows did teach us. Those small-town Southern or rural values would be replaced by a show that would be set in the past, when some of those problematic ideals and simpleton ways weren't so glaringly obvious. A different time. The Waltons would debut in 1972 and set the stage for family values that would spawn the TV adaptation of Laura Ingalls Wilder's books, The Little House on the Prairie, 2 seasons later. Still country, rural, or Southern, but not current day. From a different time. TV executives were just waiting for the trend to come back around. It never did fully, but these shows would set the stage for the return to rural America later that decade, thanks to some help from films like Smokey and the Bandit. The 1977 film depicted heartthrob Burt Reynolds as Bandit, and Smokey was the cop. Eastbound and down, loaded up in truck, and they were going to do what Hollywood said couldn't be done. They made America love the scoundrel. America had turned to anti-heroes before, but Burt Reynolds was a rural cowboy hat-wearing everyman with a black and gold Trans Am and a smuggling buddy to protect from the coppers. Fast cars, action, racing and stunts, sexy men, bumbling clowns for cops. It didn't matter what the bandit and his snowman were smuggling. Coors beer for those of you keeping score at home. All that mattered was fast cars, Sally Field, and Ralph Cramden bang, zoom, and to the moon as Sheriff Buford T. Justice, codenamed Smokey Bear. 2 characters in the film were named Enos, by the way. Smokey and the Bandit was a hit, the second highest grossing film of 1977 in America. Hollywood TV executives heard that loud and clear. But it was a film 2 years before Smokey and the Bandit called Moonrunners that actually gets the adaptation credit. Moonrunners was about a Southern family who runs bootleg liquor for their Uncle Jesse, running from the cops in their fast car set to outlaw music and narrated by Waylon Jennings. In 1979, CBS would debut its own Moonrunners with a little Smokey and the Bandit flair. The hags in the film were the Dukes on TV with the big bad boss named Hog. The Boar's Nest bar made the switch, but other minor differences set it apart, better or worse. The hags' car was named Traveler after General Robert E. Lee's horse. The Duke's car would be named for the Confederate general and would brandish the treasonous traitor flag on the Dodge Charger's roof. A return to primetime TV for modern setting Southern stories. The Dukes of Hazzard had everything the Andy Griffith Show had, and then some. You had Uncle Jesse, who was kind of like Andy and Aunt Bee rolled into one, but with a really hot daughter named Daisy known for her short shorts. Mayberry didn't have a lot of poster girl sex symbols. You had the good-natured character, torn between being a good person and being a cop, which was Deputy Enos. It's hard to argue was intentionally named that to pick up some of that bandit clout. Cletus, the mechanic who kept the boys race car racing, undoubtedly spent most of his budget on shocks and suspension. That thing had to have a rebuilt title, you know? It seemed like everybody conspired to keep these outlawed Duke boys safe from the corrupt and conspiring boss Hogg, who seemed to have Sheriff Roscoe P. Coltrane in his pocket. Nevertheless, Friday nights were rip-roaring racing shenanigans with the sexiest Southerners this side of Shiloh. But what did America get for those 6 seasons in a depiction of the South? Let's focus on just the lessons of law and order. We were introduced to the ideas of small-town Southern corruption, but also that it's okay to fight the system illegally. The Dukes weren't heroes fighting the corruption. There were laws in place, you know what I mean? Preventing their smuggling and moonshine. Now, we can argue the merits of that fictional law in that fictional town, but these fictional people broke those fictional laws of that fictional land and were heralded as the heroes of the show for 147 Fridays. then on forever in syndication and the 24/7 cycle of streaming. Maybe the Dukes of Hazzard was the necessary distraction of what the police had actually done throughout the previous 2 decades. Maybe the Dukes of Hazzard was the depictional payback for that brutality. By the late 1980s, America was transitioning away from Reagan and Nixon, but we still had a former CIA director in the White House. America's embrace of the law and order Nixonian white supremacy dog whistles of crime and gang violence was like a bear hug. More and more shows put on one side of the story, the cops. Then in March of 1989, America was ready for reality. The documentary-style follow-along nail-biter Cops premiered on Fox Network, owned by Rupert Murdoch. For 35 seasons and going and streaming and forever online, Americans the world have had the back row seat at the action, as the cops are called. As the carefully deliberate and creative editing for entertainment purposes only dictated a single-sided pro-police narrative audiences binged and binged and binged, those ideas like cops were here to protect and serve and didn't act like depressive, racist, sociopathic dicks in some cases. No, America had been dumbed down and numbed down to the true atrocities of American law enforcement. We had been primed to jump right back into that sugary sweet Schadenfreudian gladiator pit. Whatever happened in real life, we wouldn't care. It wouldn't faze us. We saw that play out already in primetime, for entertainment purposes only. America wouldn't be shocked by what they saw now. America went fan-crazed over cops like this was America's fascist home videos. America has a troubling history with police, white supremacy, racism, and classism. This history goes back before we were even a United States, and it's been deeply ingrained into the fabric of American society. In fact, up until very recently, racism might have been considered a cultural norm. From the early days of slave patrols to the modern era of police brutality, racial discrimination has been an ever-present pall cast over law enforcement. Modern policing's DNA in the United States can be traced back to the early 1800s when urbanization and industrialization led to the creation of professional police forces in some of America's founding cities. However, the first organized law enforcement in America was not what we would recognize today as a police force. Or would we? In the pre-emancipation sociopathic South, slave patrols were organized groups of white men tasked with policing and controlling the movements of slaves, keeping slaves where they were supposed to be, and returning any lost slaves back to, well, someone. These pre-police slave patrols were created to maintain the status quo of slavery, abuse, dehumanization, and oppression, and to prevent rebellion or uprising, and to prevent an insurrection. Those slave patrols were an early, unofficial, not-so-well-regulated militia mixed with the king's men from the motherland. They patrolled plantations and urban areas, searching for runaway slaves and punishing those who disobeyed their owners and anyone who got in their way. They had the run of the roost. Wherever they went, whomever they went after. After the Civil War and the abolition of slavery, many southern states implemented black codes which restricted the freedoms of newly freed black people. These black codes were then twisted from slave patrol to Jim Crow enforcement teams. This in turn led to the creation of police departments that were designed to enforce these laws and maintain white supremacy. Police departments in southern states were almost exclusively made up of white officers who viewed black people as inherently criminal and dangerous, less than human. Did you get that feeling watching the Andy Griffith Show or the Dukes of Hazzard growing up? During Reconstruction, as the rural white oppression seeped throughout America, our country's toxic white Southern culture was charging full steam ahead, normalized in the public specter. With more and more former slaves and their descendants fleeing southern states, making their way north, hoping for a kinder existence, they were met with much of the same treatment they experienced down south. In fact, they learned quickly that even if abolitionists thought they shouldn't be slaves, many of them didn't want the African slaves here. Remember again, the average age of a slave in the early 1860s was around 8 or 9. They were bred like livestock, then freed from slavery with little to no education or class protections. They were just free. During the early 20th century, police departments in the North and Midwest also began to adopt discriminatory practices, often targeting black and other minority groups and communities. One of the most infamous examples of this was the Red Summer of 1919, a period of intense racial violence and rioting across the United States. During this time, white mobs attacked and killed black people in more than 20 cities, while police officers often stood by and did nothing. Then there was the 1921 Greenwood, Oklahoma, Black Wall Street, Tulsa Race Massacre, and the town that just didn't exist anymore. We didn't see that depicted in prime time. Throughout the mid-20th century, the civil rights movement brought about significant changes in the American society, including the desegregation of public schools and public spaces. This made a lot of people very angry. It's almost as if TV network executives created this 1960s programming that harkened back to the comfortable 1950s so the audience wouldn't boil over amidst the growing socio-cultural tensions. Maybe these shows were their binky. However, despite these advancements, desegregation and the Civil Rights Acts, police departments remained resistant to the change in the streets and in the precincts. In many cases, police, not just in the rural South, actively opposed the integration of their own forces, but this was particularly true in the South, where police departments were often used to suppress civil rights protests and intimidate activists. Never saw it on Mayberry, though. In the 1960s, police departments across the country began to adopt more aggressive and militaristic tactics in response to civil unrest and political protests. The Watts riots of 1965, which erupted in a predominantly black neighborhood of Los Angeles, marked a turning point in this trend that wasn't played out on network TV. In the aftermath of the riots, police departments began to receive increased funding for weapons and equipment, which often led to the militarization of police forces. This was a stark contrast to the philosophy of August Vollmer's revolutionary understanding of law enforcement. Throughout the latter half of the 20th century, police brutality against black people became increasingly common, with numerous high-profile cases attracting national attention. The beating of Rodney King in Los Angeles in 1991, which was caught on video and broadcast around the world, led to riots and protests around the country. Amadou Diallo in New York City in 1999, who was shot 41 times by police officers who mistook his wallet for a gun, highlighted the issue of racial profiling and police violence. The 21st century has seen a continuation of these trends, with numerous cases of police brutality against black people sparking protests and demands for reform. None of this is news. None of this is new. This was all happening in the mid-20th century, but Americans were allowed to resist this change with the saccharine cancer food of entertaining oblivion. With Rodney King, the emergence of portable film technology brought these incidents to more light. 3 decades later, the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis in 2020 was also captured on video. This led to a nationwide reckoning with racism and police brutality. This event, along with the deaths of Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and numerous others, proved we haven't nearly advanced as much as we think. They led to widespread protests and calls for systematic change. Despite the ongoing struggles and activism against the racism and police brutality, progress has been slow and uneven. Many police departments continue to use discriminatory practices, such as racial profiling. The use of excessive force against black people remains common practice, not just in the South. This toxic white Southern culture of bullying and dehumanization, toxic masculinity, has spread like the cancer it is throughout America. Today in America, the police often operate with impunity, protected by powerful unions and legal immunity from prosecution, retribution, or retaliation. We the people remain oppressed, all but forced to report to work day in, day out. The slave patrols never went away. We just gave them blue uniforms and unionized them. One has to ask, why would anyone choose to wear that uniform? Maybe they'll say they hope they could change it from the inside. Regardless, America and Americans have been brainwashed, gaslit, and manipulated with our sense of values and patriotism. They're tied directly to our ideas on law enforcement. The crossing of those streams has left us with the unquestioning, unwavering loyalty to police. The idea of back the blue for any American should be something that turns our stomachs, as free, liberty-loving United Statesians, of course. Instead, some are slapping that thin blue line all over their cars, flags, clothing. When anyone suggests anyone else's life matters, some will be the first to remind you that blue lives matter, even though blue lives aren't a thing. What kind of person, ... What kind of person chooses to support the unionized militarized mafia over their fellow civilian? Hopefully, after this, you see a little clearer why it's been so easy for so many to chuck their humanity to the wind. Cheer for the bad cop. Lethal Weapon, right? Riggs was the fun wild card. Murtaugh was boring and safe. Nobody wanted to play as Murtaugh. Everybody wanted to play like Riggs. Except we all grew up and realized now that Riggs, well, Mel Gibson, is a white supremacist, a mentally deranged, delusional religious cultist, and in all likelihood, a Nazi. Or at least close enough for guilt by association. Their ideals align closer than mine do to a Nazi, I'll say that. Look, it's good cop, bad cop for a reason. It's a dynamic that only works on TV and in movies. Because what it's taken us too long to learn is that for every Riggs bending the rules, there's a Murtaugh watching him, letting him and not saying anything, and helping him cover it up. What it took us too long to learn is that there is no good cop when there's a bad cop. When there's a bad cop, all cops are bad. Coming up, over the next several episodes, I'm exploring this culture of bullying a little more. I've discussed some of this before this season, but I'm looking at the term snowflake and the idea that being sensitive is a bad thing. We're in a culture that demonizes education and intellectuals, then doubles down that demonization when it comes to things like emotional intelligence. It's that low IQ that's the issue in America, friends. Low intelligence. Intellectual, academic, and emotional. When we seek to identify the roots of the issues at play in my overarching theme of this season, it's hard to argue education and intelligence aren't at play. In the next episode, Snowflake and the 7 Deadly Sins, I'm exploring the culture of bully, rhetoric, and punchline personality that's infected our society. I'm asking, why are we like this? A big chunk of answering that question lies in brainwashing, indoctrination, and grooming us while we're young and impressionable. I'm spending the next few episodes laying out my own struggles, challenges, and toxicities, and tracing back where some of them come from. Our experiences aren't all that different, and we'll find out that it's those experiences, those traumas, that lead us into our respective pens of opinion, as I'm deconstructing a culture of cultism. Thanks for joining me. My book, Overthinking Everything About You, a compassion and critical thinking workbook, is available on Amazon, and you can link to it through my website, joshbrandonmedia.com. Check out some of my other videos on YouTube. I've got all my original music, my TikToks, Overthinking Everything, and clips of my voice acting career. It's all in playlists for you, so check that out for your convenience. You can check out my merch store, get your trigger tees, bumper stickers, mugs, more. Sir Talks a Lot, Swags a Lot store on my website. More products coming soon. Follow me on TikTok and everywhere online. Like, share, and subscribe to this channel. Support me any way you can. Do all the things I need you to do to help me grow so we can grow. And if you like this series, consider a donation to Cash App. Don't forget to sign up for my email list too. I'm Josh Brandon, and I'm overthinking everything.